Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Springtime Bud Marr.
You are wearing a very springtime shirt.
I
am. It is, if not at this moment, looking outside where you're at, springy.
It's probably snowing for our listeners.
Yeah, you never know. But
that groundhog saw like his shadow a few times this year.
In general, we're just going to say we are broadcasting from the middle of spring-ish Iowa.
And it's beautiful regardless.
That's right. Iowa, such a looker no matter what season it happens to be. Here on Iowa Catholic Radio Studios. Thank you for listening to our show. But, you know, one of the weird things about being in academia is it's technically the spring semester, even in January. So it is springtime here at Mercy College of Health Sciences, where we both work and who underwrites our show. Spring semester's getting done. You know, it's going to be done here for us at the end of April. But mchs.edu, thank you for underwriting our show. You should go there to check out and consider what degrees and when to start would be good for you.
Well, it's kind of nice to get to the end of March, early April, where the weather starts to match the semester. So we've been talking about the spring semester for several weeks now, and now it's like, oh, yeah, it truly is sort of a spring semester. I don't know when our listeners are going to catch this. Maybe you're listening live, but if not, you know, I know many like jump to the podcast. If you do hear this episode before April 14th, we've got a great celebration coming at the college, the inauguration of the fourth president of Mercy College of Health Sciences, Dr. Adrian Henry. And I mentioned this on air because everyone is invited to a mass that's taking place that morning. So the Bishop William Joensen, is going to celebrate a mass as part of the inauguration festivities at 9 a.m. at St. Ambrose Cathedral. So it should be a great experience. Always wonderful to hear the bishop, hear him preach, be with him in the celebration of the Eucharist.
Absolutely. You can go to mchs.edu/inauguration. I'm not going to spell that because I'll mess it up, and then you'll all wonder why Mercy College underwrites the show. Yeah. But you can go there, and that's all the details that you need. We'd love to have you at that Mass. One more time, April 14th. That's Friday, 9 a.m. We would love to have you with us for the celebration of Dr. Adrian Henry, fourth president of Mercy College of Health Sciences, and they underwrite our show. We are happy to be underwritten and representing Mercy College of Health Sciences. Now, Bud, you're right. I know that it's spring, even if sometimes I look out and the trees look very bare, because I'm already starting to feel like my sinuses are filling up. So it's at least around the corner, if it is not, in fact, barreling down the alleyway towards us.
Oh, yeah, my sinus signals have definitely fully gone off. But, you know, we're actually nearing the end of Lent. It's crazy, one of those experiences in the Catholic Church each year where when it starts, you're like, I'm never going to make it. And then, you know, you get to Passiontide and Holy Week, and it's like, wow, this went by fast. So for the show today, we've decided actually to talk about the Eucharist, the celebration of the liturgy, the Mass. I know as Catholics, you know, we like to have multiple technical terms for these things, but I think, Bo, it is it's very well suited for this period where we're journeying to Easter very quickly. So we're going to be talking about like how the celebration of the Mass is not simply a memorial meal, but a kind of representation of what took place at Calvary and the significance of all that for our lives.
Memory is important. Remembering even more important. And we want to talk about how not only the Eucharist tells us something about how we should be remembering differently, but I'm hoping, Bud, that with this episode, people get a chance to really have the right sort of comportment, mindset towards this week that's coming up, Holy Week into Easter week. We're not just sort of recalling events of the past, but there's a real way to live into that. I think there's plenty of shows on Iowa Catholic Radio talking about ways that you can really enter into the Holy Week and Eastern season. Particularly, we're hoping to sort of set the stage that makes that a deeper participation in lived reality. And we can start by considering the Eucharist and our practices here as the season, the last of Lent ends and Easter truly begins. So looking forward to the conversation today. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We are so glad to have you with us. Whether you're listening live on the many stations on Iowa Catholic Radio, I should say in the middle of Iowa, and out in, so I want to make a big point, Bud. Like sometimes people think Iowa Catholic Radio, they just think Des Moines, but actually there's all sorts of places that we've been adding. So all of you people listening throughout the great land of Iowa live via the radio signals, plural. It's great to have you with us. Also, people who are listening on iowacatholicradio.com, anywhere you can have that internet connection. Also, Iowa Catholic Radio app, wherever you get the data. And then finally, anybody who is joining us on podcast, it is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful to have you on the show. Bud, we had the great fortune. I was going to say we were at a conference, but I was there bodily, you were there Zoom bodily, but the point is that we got to give a talk at a conference, so shout out to Benedictine College, their Transforming Culture Conference. We're kind of all-stars at this point, Bud. We've done it a few times. Yeah,
it is one of my favorite, but you're right. I was more excarnate in my experience because I had to patch in from a hotel room for the talk.
Not because Bud was on the run from the law, but because he was at a different conference doing college administration stuff because you are a responsible adult, Bud.
Far less exciting, but essential. So I tried to focus in Chicago at the annual convention of the Higher Learning Commission.
That's right. When I think people who aren't a part of academic world, Higher Learning Commission sounds like something from the Star Wars universe.
Or Brave New World.
Yeah, that's right. But usually just some folks who care about education trying to make sure people are dotting I's and crossing T's. So we're not trying to imply anything about by the science fiction that we just mentioned, but I have to say the title, I think, comes off that way sometimes.
No, that's right. The Higher Learning Commission, in brief, very brief, is like quality control for colleges and universities. So they do important work.
But we want to talk about important work we do because this will sound like we're petty and defending ourselves. I know you all think philosophers and theologians just sit on our duffs and do nothing, but sometimes we stand, do nothing, and sometimes, Bud, we stand and deliver. We give talks. Now, the whole conference was great. I think they're going to put at least some of the talks up online, if I'm not mistaken. So Benedictine College, if you go to their website, you should be able to find Transforming Culture and hopefully at some point see the talks. The whole thing was on the Eucharist, and Bud and I were talking about the liturgy. Instead of repeating our two talks, because I think Bud, they might show them, I think we might be talking about working them into essays. What I wanted to bring up is a theme that came up ancillary and incidentally to people talking about the Eucharist, but in our talk specifically. And it has everything to do, I think, with kind of making sense of these weeks leading up to Easter that we're all in the middle of. And that's the idea of what does it mean to remember? What does it mean to draw from the past? What does it mean to relate to the past, but maybe avoid some connotations that I think have become negative, like nostalgia, for instance, or the idea of like living in the past, but also avoiding other vicious ways of dealing with time, like only thinking about the future or making no plans or having no respect for tradition. All of these things come up, of course, I think, Bud, because in the Eucharist, we believe that Christ's reality on the cross, his offering to the Father, is represented, remembered. Yeah. It becomes embodied through transubstantiation before us again. So this question, Bud, of how the past lives in the present and points to the future, ever present for Catholic theology. But I think there was just really interesting ways that it kept being brought up, not only in our talk, but in the entire conference, that should make us stop and think here as we're heading towards Good Friday and into Easter.
Well, our culture really values newness and forward thinking, and I could see a skeptic or a critic of Christianity saying, why are Catholics so fixated on the past? Like, this is such a huge part of your regular worship experience, like a calling to mind of the past. And I think, I love that that term that you used, Bo, in your last comment about representation, because when we use the word, like if we pronounced it differently and we said that the Mass is a representation of Calvary, that would sound like it was just simply a kind of memorial, like you have these symbols that just point to something that took place a long time ago. But when you use that phrase representation, that in a sense, by celebrating the liturgy, the passion is brought into our midst, that gives it a whole different perspective. I think this is very biblical. Ironically, I grew up in a Bible church, and they would celebrate what they called the Lord's Supper, and like only quarterly. So once every 3 months, they would celebrate the Lord's Supper. But one day on which they did this was Good Friday. And we all know as Catholics, like Good Friday has certain connotations, and the liturgy takes on a different shape on that day. So for us, it seems odd in a way to know that like some evangelical Protestants, they do their Lord's Supper 4 times a year, and one of those days is Good Friday. But it's because for them, it really is a memorial meal. It's calling to mind the work of Christ on the cross, but they don't have the same sacramental vision that we do. For the ancient liturgies, by ancient liturgies, I mean the ones that reach back to the time of the apostles. So really in Roman Catholicism and then various forms of Eastern Christianity, the celebration of the Mass or the Divine Liturgy is not simply a memorial meal. It does have remembering or a calling to mind component to it. But when I say that it's biblical that the cross is represented to us, if you look at Scripture, so if you look at the Passover meal, the actual celebration of the sacrifice puts those events, like, I was going to say literally, but like sacramentally into the celebration that's taking place. So when the Jews to this day celebrate the Passover, they talk in such a way as if the events happened right in front of their eyes, that by celebrating the Passover, they're being given a glimpse of God's salvific activity when he brought the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. And for us, like at the Mass, you could say in a certain sense we're brought to the very foot of the cross.
I don't want to, prolong this too much, but to have a short fight with you about which former evangelical tradition you and I come from, what made more sense. I know multiple evangelical communities do, like you say, they have the Eucharist quarterly. The Baptist church I grew up in, they only did it once, and it was Good Friday. So because they're like, oh yeah, it is a memorial of that day. But what I think is interesting is when you choose the quarterly system. The quarterly system. They're all like, well, you get reports about the economy, and you have a memorial
report cards, yeah.
Did they ever go into like the justification of the other 3?
No, it's strange. I mean, I guess there's a regularity to it. It's funny now as a Catholic, the institution of the Eucharist is such a central part of the New Testament. And Jesus says, as often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me. Mm-hmm. And so you think like this command by Christ, like Jesus doesn't elaborate and say like, it ought to be remembered this often, but like there is like the question's very pregnant.
Well, and I mean, I think it's funny. And to be less hammering to even either of our evangelical communities. Yeah. When we were in Protestant seminary, and so like dealing with I guess you'd call magisterial or mainline Protestants. Yeah. That was another one too. Is like they would get weird ideas about this. Like, well, it really should just be once a month. You're like, why once a month? I mean, I can understand Sunday because it's the celebration of that event, and then I can understand like once a year, Good Friday. But what I'm getting at is it seems like now we're just having an hour picking on the past, but we're talking about remembering, bud. So I'm remembering. The reason I bring this up is, to your point, whatever we mean by a memorial, if it only is to sort of mark an occasion, we have a weird way of doing this in secular calendars. We're like, oh, well, it's the same day in the year, so we're going to mark this, and for whatever reason, we decided if it's multiples of 5, that's a bigger deal. We're like, well, 5-year anniversary. Okay, 6, 10, 13. So I know that people probably think I'm really driving a point home for no good reason, but it's strange to me about if you don't have this idea that in remembering the past, it becomes present to you. Why is it that certain things, like why is it the yearly basis? Why is it that we think that like round numbers make the anniversary more important. For me, Bud, this is sort of ghosts of the Catholic commonality behind all of this, whether this is in Europe or in America. And I think it's the secular imitation of feast days, but they get rid of the saint. And so there's not this idea of like, oh, well, the saint died this day or was born this day or whatever it might be, but certainly it's the saint celebrated this day. But it's just weird to be like, oh, yeah, well, you know, and I mean, to put it crass, I mean, like things that matter very much to me, like there's been airplane crashes at Oklahoma State where we lost coaches and team members, and that's something worthy to memorialize and think about. But you're like, why is the 10 and the 20th year more important than anything else? Except that I think it's sort of grafted onto this thicker notion that when you remember the past, it comes alive to us again. Because we don't do that, but I think a lot of times we celebrate either the very beginning or ending of things, but not the idea that they still, you know, when we celebrate the saints, we go, because we know you're in heaven, buddy, or, you know, lady, and we think today's just a special day to remind you to intervene for us. And I think already that starts to show this divergence of misunderstanding between the Catholic worldview and the more American Protestant and then subsequently secular one.
Well, I think that's right, and I think a lot of these practices are the practical outworking of these groups' theologies. And so you mentioned churches that may only do this once a year, or for the evangelical church that I grew up in 4 times a year. And if it is just a calling to mind, if it's a remembering sort of in a memorial sense, you could see how it would mirror something like Christmas. So Christmas, we remember this seminal historical event, and properly speaking, you do it on the date that it occurred. And so some churches that don't have this fully sacramental understanding, like it, you know, that's kind of where they fall. Then you mentioned more mainline Protestants like Presbyterians and Methodists and things like this, and they have this kind of semblance in their mind, like, oh, like Christ is present in a unique sense. And so they start to develop this understanding, like this should be more regular. And of course, you know, for instance, Methodists look back to John and Charles Wesley, who had a more robust Eucharistic understanding than maybe current day Methodists. And so they feel like they're recovering something from their past. Then you get to like Eastern Orthodox Christians who are very similar to Catholicism, but even there, they don't really have the habit or tradition of like daily mass. I think for Catholics, it's a combination of Christ, our Lord, being present in this unique sense sacramentally. And so it's the closest that we can draw to God. But also, so Eastern Christians they'll refer to the liturgy as an oblation. So they certainly have an idea that it has a sacrificial character. But this, I think, has been enhanced in our own tradition. And this can be tied to what we're saying about like remembering in the kind of like special character that has in the biblical understanding, where for Catholics, like we talk about this, like the sacrifice of the Mass being propitiatory for the living and the dead. And so if it has this sort of, redemptive character where it's really like the application of sacramental graces to our lives, and it could be efficacious as we remember the faithful departed, it makes sense that like you would set aside priests who would celebrate this daily.
Yeah, and so this is one of the talk. This is referring to one of the talks at the Benedictine conference. So John Cavadini, theologian at Notre Dame, who he heads up the McGrath Institute for Church Life Journal. You know, Bud and I have done a lot of stuff over there with him. So he was talking about transubstantiation, particularly. He brought it in all sorts of cool directions. He talked about how the Eucharist makes us have to care for the poor. I just want to bring up this particular point he makes because, again, if the video shows up, everyone should go find it. It was a fantastic talk. But he's making this point that, and he's riffing on Benedict XVI, that in the Eucharist, Jesus doesn't give us a part of himself. He gives us himself entirely. It is a holocaust, a whole burnt offering. He gives himself completely. So this is why Christ can't physically give us only part of his body, because then it would be a thing.
Yeah.
It would be like, you know, his finger, or even if it was weirdly transmuted, but you're like, oh, well, part of the bread is like representative of part of his body. it would then again be a thing. It wouldn't be himself whole and entire. That's why transubstantiation has to be doctrinally the case. It was a wonderful point just in general, but the idea that he's pointing at is because only the accidents stay, but the substances change, something is able to happen that's miraculous but wouldn't happen anywhere else, Bud, which is to say there's a local way in which you and I participate through the accidents of the sacramental species, the bread and the wine, but the substance is unchanging, right, and not multiplied. It's the one Christ. And so he, of course, and he's making this point that this is a foretaste of heaven, the truest foretaste you'd have. Beautiful point. What I want to bring up for what we're talking about here is that's also the way in which we're not just recalling, right? Yeah. So like when we're talking about remembering, we're not just recalling that the event happened. In the Eucharist, because of transubstantiation, the event is there. And it's not even fair to say again, because it's not repeated. It's the same event. And so when we say we remember it, when we re-participate, it's not just, oh, remember what happened 2,000 years ago. It is the miraculous way we feast on that event once more, because it's there, not again, it's there in perpetuity. It's even there in heaven, like with the preponderance of Christ's wounds in heaven. So it's not memory like I'm recalling what happened. And even this, but I forgot who I was talking to. Was this our friend? I forget who this was. Marr, dang it.
This is a sign of how many meaningful conversations Bo has.
But whoever it is that I'm totally stealing this from, but God bless them, is, there's a way you argue, actually it's Cormac McCarthy in one of his new books.
You were talking to Cormac McCarthy?
No, I was reading his book. But, there's this question of when you remember, you don't actually remember the event. You have a memory of the memory you had before. Now, I think there's an argument. We can't solve that one on the radio. But you get this problem that starts to be what's funny about this, Bud, is if all we do is recall that Christ died for our sins, we are remembering a memory of the church's memory, but it's like a genetic, right? There's all these memories going back, and then you worry about, is it a distorted memory? How true is it? Do we manipulate it, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah. One of the things that the church ensures through transubstantiation, which of course Christ is the one ensuring this, is there is not this sort of going all the way back, recalling a recollection of a recollection. It is, as it were, held within the fact of the transubstantiated host. And so that's why memory has to be considered completely different when we think of the Christian faith as the Catholic Church expounds it.
Well, there's so much to say here, and that's what's tough about tackling the topic of the Eucharist is like it kind of infinitely unfolds. But as you were talking, the point that it brought to mind for me, and I love it. So for me, coming into the Catholic Church really was like an Emmaus Road experience, where there are these two disciples and they're traveling to Emmaus, and Jesus walks along with them. The risen Lord walks with them. And during the journey, they don't recognize who he is. They're amazed at what he's saying, but they don't recognize who he is until he sits down with them for dinner. And it's in the breaking of the bread that their eyes are open. After becoming Catholic and being drawn into the Eucharistic life of the church, there are all these like wonderful connections that I can see in retrospect. But I'm thinking specifically of a line from 1 Peter where St. Peter says, through our incorporation in the church, we are made partakers of the divine nature. And I was like, how do we partake of the divine nature? Well, we do so if Christ feeds us with his body and blood, which he does in the Eucharist. So like you're saying, Bo, the celebration of the Mass, it really collapses both time and space. Like it fuses together where we are in our own historical moment with the central moment of history, what took place at the foot of the cross, but we're also drawn up to heaven. So there's a prayer in the Roman canon that says, it's basically a request that an angel would take the host before the throne of God. So you can see we join our voices with choirs of angels and archangels. I love that image of how are we going to become partakers of the divine nature? How is God going to transmit his life to us? Well, through this sacrifice at Calvary, that's not simply something that took place years ago and we just remember. Grace isn't an idea or a proposition. It's something that God actually extends to us, and it's amazing that he does so through tangible things like bread, wine, holy oils, holy water, etc.
No, I think this is great. It's great to be able to remember all of this with you, Bud, on air. But speaking of on air, we need to go to the break. This is the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. This is the Uncommon Good. Stick around, and we'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you, all of you out there listening in Iowa Catholic Radio land, here in the center of the state, listening on the radio to our broadcast. Thank you for listening on iowacatholicradio.com. Thank you for listening to Iowa Catholic Radio's app, wherever you receive data. And then, of course, thank you, everyone who is listening on the podcast. Bud, we're talking about remembering in the sort of profound, deep, thickest Catholic sense as exhibited by the Eucharist. I think it's important for us to do here as we enter Passiontide. And just a quick example of this, Bud, I had my Protestant parents in town, and they were listening to the kids' choir, and they're looking around and like, well, why are you guys covering all your statues, right? Or, do they need dusted or something like this? And, of course, you talk about, well, this is because we're remembering this part of the gospel where Jesus turns his face to Jerusalem, right? And he concentrates on the road down to Calvary on the cross and his resurrection. So we, of course, the big Catholic faith that we are, in love with artistic imagery, cover those images, not to say that they're bad, but to, focus our mind to remember this event. And we try to do so by making it enfleshed by something as simple as covering statues with cloth. So I think that might be a good way to walk into when we talk about remembering. Like we said in the first segment, it's not just this idea of recalling what happened in the past, but how do we make what is eternal in the past live in the present of the now as a foretaste of the future that we are living towards, eternity in heaven with God. So the Eucharist obviously is the whole center and locus of how this happens, but maybe we can expound on that more.
Well, yeah, I think this is key, and I've probably got to tread carefully in this next series of comments because I do know most Catholics care a great deal about the celebration of the Mass, and I think our parishes have their own sometimes like sort of traditions or ways of doing things, and so I don't want to just be like give the impression like I'm just sideswiping and saying anyone is necessarily doing it wrong, but the Church has, in her wisdom, given us directives about the celebration of the Mass. And so, like, even if you turn to the documents of the Second Vatican Council, there's a comment, for instance, in the one about worship that says, like, Gregorian chant is ideally suited for the celebration of the Mass, and it kind of extrapolates that, it elaborates upon that. Or it says, like, the pipe organ has this historic place in the celebration of the Mass, and it's suited to it by virtue of its own sort of characteristics. At different times, like Pope Benedict XVI was someone who said, like, really, like, clapping doesn't properly have a place in the Mass because we're there for the adoration of God, and too often that sort of activity is a celebration of a performance that has taken place. In all these cases, like, when you read them on the surface, like, the church leaders who give the teachings, they might seem like fuddy-duds, but it's really wrestling with and helping to give the faithful guidance about if this is a representation of Calvary, if what is taking place is that in some way, sacramentally, we're mystically brought to the foot of Calvary, what sort of decorum would be proper to that event? If we're being a glimpse of the sacrifice that was made at the cross, like, that's going to change maybe, like, even your demeanor and posture. Now, this could all be nuanced. I know there's, like, questions about enculturation and sort of, like, maybe a certain style of dance in one culture has a different connotation than, like, what we properly conceive as popular dance here in the United States. But all these things to say, there is, like, as Catholics, we should care a great deal about our liturgical heritage and drawing upon those historic forms like Gregorian chant. Insofar as we can do that, I do think we're rooted in our past and given like a deeper understanding of what's taking place at Mass.
No, I think this is important. On one hand, this gets at the idea of remembering, but it might seem like a side note, and then I'll get back more properly to it. On one hand, I like that you pointed out about enculturation, that it's not that, the definitive understanding of what the Mass should look like is a European one, but it's certainly the case, like you said, that what is important is, okay, the Mass is occurring in your culture. Well, in any culture, there needs to be the respect shown however your culture shows it. So to your point, there are cultures where dancing specifically is reserved as a sort of implication of high regard to someone. Yeah. Whereas I would say in the United States, I would argue with anyone to think that our dancing culture is that. That's not to say like ours is bad, but certainly you wouldn't think of it in those terms. Same thing with perhaps it could be in a culture you could imagine, but where clapping is only given to dignitaries, or is considered divine. I don't know. But certainly it's the case that in ours, clapping is for performance, and that undermines this sort of common way in which we're worshiping God rather than, to clap makes it sound like we were supposed to be paying attention to the performer rather than God. Yeah. That's what Benedict is getting at. So, in linguistics, we talk about how there's terms, which is the case of the thing we're trying to describe, but then there's the words we use to describe the terms. And if you're a realist about truth, terms don't change, but the words we do will change because words shift, they slide, we have to come up with new ones. And so I think liturgically, right, we want to say there's liturgical terms underneath liturgical expression. Yeah. The terms can't change, or they should be, let me put it this way, they should be consistent across all cultures, even if a liturgical expression might be distinct depending on the culture you're a part of. A very easy one to show that this is not completely new. Of course, the Catholic world has always understood that the Latin Rite and the Eastern Rite have very different liturgical expression. The argument is that the liturgical terms undergirding them are the same, and that is because, now this does get to the way in which we think all things wrapped up in liturgy about remembering. Yeah. We think there are things that are unchanging about what we're doing when we worship God and we come close to Him in the Eucharist. And so there should be things we as well do, Bud, that are undergirded by unchanging terms and principles, even if as life goes on, of course, there are organic changes that occur simply because of the fact that human communities change the way that they express that terminology that they believe.
Well, and what's fascinating in our current landscape is that there is a movement in certain circles to recover more traditional expressions of liturgy. So the use of incense and Gregorian chant, and I know like in certain parishes, like Tenebrae celebrations have cropped up around Holy Week. And I say fascinating because oftentimes these recoveries are on the part of young people. So if you do campus ministry on a lot of college campuses today, the most like tradition-minded people in the town oftentimes are the college students. And I remember talking to a nun at Duke University, funny enough, and she was surprised at how many of the students she was ministering to wanted to practice like Eucharistic adoration and benediction. And she's like, we sort of moved away from that like over the last couple decades. And I have all these students coming to me and asking for it with the chant, with the incense, etc. And funny enough, Bo, in academic circles where people are writing more like on the liturgy, like stepping back in a more like reflective manner, you'll sometimes meet older academics who accuse these younger Catholics of being nostalgic. And this is interesting. I'm hoping this can be a little bit of an alley-oop to share some of what you did at Benedictine. But we were talking about this past weekend, like how can we say younger Catholics are nostalgic for these older expressions of the liturgy that they never really grew up with or experienced as a younger person?
Yeah, no, I think I appreciate it. That was a good setup for, I'll try to give truncated versions of what we were talking about, at least on this nostalgia and memory part. Nostalgia, technically, you can't experience it if you haven't been to those places. Now, I think other people might say, well, we've just sort of, we've widened the word, this general idea about like remembering and wishing you could be in the past. But just, I think, because it makes sense to talk about the history of the word, where it came up, it's a neologism. It only comes about in the 1600s. And what's funny is if you read the history of the word, at one point I think they only thought Swedish people could have it. And it was this idea that, the Swedish people, they physically get this problem called nostalgia where they miss home so much that they basically become useless and can't do their work. This is then expanded by the 1800s. You get people talking about nostalgia, for instance, in the Civil War, because people have gone far from home to fight these battles, and they're useless as soldiers because they miss home so much. So it's something... It's not just homesickness. It's like, homesickness seems metaphorical from its beginning. This is like, no. These people are exhibiting a sort of problem that is coming about because they aren't where they used to be, and that used to be would be home.
Well, and I think in these academic writings that I'm mentioning, like that's precisely what the theologians mean. Like there's this group of Catholics who's too attached to the past that they're not really like made for the present, like not properly functioning in the here and now.
And so that's what, of course, is very interesting when, of course, Bud, you and I have experience not only in campus ministries, but in like Latin masses or more traditional masses or all these things like this. There's simply young people that could have never experienced the Mass before 1970.
Yeah.
And like you said, they're the ones asking for this. Now, not uniformly. We're not saying something silly like it's every young kid does this. But I would have to say that if you look at that group, they certainly skew young.
Yeah.
It is mostly people who have never experienced the Mass before 1970, for instance. It's a lot of people who would have never experienced Tenebra, how it used to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what I argue in that paper is that I actually think this is because of particularities of the digital age, that actually the digital age is very much about memory and about having a hunger for memory, that the television age, like our media culture very much dominated by radio and then television, but through most of the 20th century, at least through sort of like the 70s into the 80s. And so it's no wonder that television's very much engaged with projection, participation in a good way, but maybe more negatively, a projection of a fantasy world. And so that a group, a generation started to become sort of tired of the fantasy and was asking, what's worth remembering from the past? What's the authentic way to be Catholic? I think that word's very loaded to authenticity. But what I'm getting at is it's not proper to say they're nostalgic because it's not life experiences they have, but it's this hunger for this remembering, I think, this idea of a deep memory. How do we make the past come alive again, even though they don't have any sort of experience of it, but that exactly, I remember part of what made me become Catholic is this idea that the past of the Christian past was not just going to be recalled. Oh, we're not going to sit and recall what Jesus was like or what the church used to be. We believed it was present here. It was able to be before us now, and that memory could live among us. And that's why I think if we describe that as nostalgia, we miss the point. And even if we want to criticize, for instance, maybe an over-obsession with the past so much that it obscures the present, it still isn't nostalgia for most of those people, but it's actually one more instance of a fantasy projection, a world that can never actually come back. Insofar as that is what people are after, it's a very television mode of getting things wrong. And what we do to cure that is not say, forget about the past.
Yeah.
It's how do we remember the eternity of the past so that it's alive in the present, pointing to the future.
Well, I tried to run with those ideas and what I argued in my own paper, which, Bud, the bridge builder that I am. No, but I really stand by this point. So, like, you're talking about the way that our experience of culture and even the way that culture is mediated to us. So you mentioned, like, the recovery of some of these older forms taking place really as the digital technologies were taking off. What I want to say in part is, like, the Catholic Church has always had, I think, a proper understanding of unity and diversity. And what I mean by that is it's saying, like, what does unity really consist of? And it has landed in a place where it said, like, a sort of uniformity or, like, monochrome experience of the liturgy wasn't necessary. So if some of our listeners were to drive to a divine liturgy in one of our Eastern Catholic churches this weekend, they would have a very different experience, but we still recognize in the celebration of that liturgy an essential foundation that we share across the Catholic Church.
The term would be the same. The expression would be different.
Yep. A priest at the altar offering the body and blood of Christ, as a gift back to the Father.
Yep.
And so in the case of like some changes to the Roman Rite, the kind of the celebration of the Mass that most of us are most familiar with, I want to say, so there are some trends and in the church to kind of like where we see recovery of these older forms as maybe like a rejection of the new. And I'm not saying that's completely unfounded, because those who are really attached to the newer form and those who are attached to really attached to the older form, they do sometimes exhibit pathology. So like you'll get the kind of academic theologians that I was talking about, and they sort of act like the newness was like, it's like the age of Aquarius, and we've reached a point in the progression of the history of the Catholic Church that like it had never been seen before. And so like we have to forge ahead, sort of, I think, with a kind of forgetfulness about some parts of the past. Mm-hmm. Now, those, like some of these younger folks or others who are drawn to the more traditional forms, they see this resourcement, this recovery, as kind of like getting back to the most authentic form in a kind of like, I hear what you say about like understanding authenticity in kind of a negative way. And so it leads to ecclesial division where like the two groups become seen as competitive. And what I want to say is like, I think if our shepherds, if they relate to both groups in a way where it's like what you're doing isn't a rejection of something else, there are certain sort of like guidelines for the celebration of the liturgy by which we're all bound, but seeing even this kind of like flowering of a return to tradition among some younger people as like an expression of a desire for a deeper experience of Christ and who he is, like there's a way where we can work with them to affirm that and to enhance ecclesial unity. So there's my soapbox and my optimistic dream for the day.
Well, but I think what was interesting is you pointed this out. This is actually in the questions that, because I get really technical. And it's too technical to drone on about very briefly, that I really do think like you can have the same words, but something can change a lot. If the grounding of it and the context change a lot, it's really actually new. And you actually make much more sense of the sociological dynamics. If you stop acting like the return of the Latin Mass as being interesting, especially to young people, is this return to the old, when really it's a new Mass in most way, like in the most important ways. You can argue about that later. But the reason I bring that up, and to get to your point, is to say, the question is like, how do you talk about the situation on the ground now correctly so we can be pastoral towards it? And as you say, and I think this is a fantastic point, one of the surefire ways that what's going on now is much different than went on before 1970 is so much of Vatican II's worries about the Mass and actually what the reformers addressed only exist in the Latin Mass because in some ways they embody those very principles more than maybe some of the people in the quote-unquote Novus Ordo, right? Like caring about Gregorian chant, for instance, that's exactly from the text. But even the idea of participation and sort of beauty and how things look, that didn't exist before 1970 because of the different context and the different understanding of, like I said, wanting a memory and authenticity now. But, one of those, I think, that we miss out is enculturation, actually, Bud, is enculturation points out, I think it was a moment waiting for a better medial environment. What I mean by this is enculturation in television land is bound to maybe reduce down to stereotypes or sort of myths, right? How is it that like we can have a commonality even if we're diverse? The digital, Bud, really is a sort of way to look at the world where we can start to see, among all the differences, right, the sort of hyperlinked way undergirding those things. And so that, to me, hopefully is a way forward that we start to say we can actually have an enculturated Mass because we're able to understand the commonalities that undergird these Masses, even if the expressions not only differ, but sort of change throughout time. It gets back into, I think, a much firmer way to understand Newman's development of doctrine, where development of doctrine isn't a supersessionism of what came before, but this idea of flowering via different branches, as it were.
No, I see we're coming up against the break, but I feel like we might have to save the full flowering of this discussion for a future episode.
Oh, no, yeah, we really should.
No, I think what you're saying is really right. And I guess, like, to put a bow on the so-called liturgy wars, like, I think the worst thing that we can do is treat it as a zero-sum game, meaning, like, one side has to be a winner, which is a terrible understanding of, like, the unity that we're called to seek in the church. And that's where I think it would be worth coming back to a later show, because what you say about digital media versus visual media versus written textual media, it really helps to explain sort of like the development of our different sorts of experiences of the Mass, and that gives us a framework for thinking about how these so-called liturgy wars don't have to be a zero-sum game.
Absolutely. We should do it. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Appreciate all the ways that you participate here with Iowa Catholic Radio. Also listening to the show either live via broadcast or on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and, of course, those who listen to us on the podcast. We appreciate it very much. Bud, as always, are we ever going to, at the end of the show, be like, man, that really actually wasn't any good?
Well, I
feel sometimes we defer a bit if we didn't think it was that
we
great.
definitely have an eye on the liturgical calendar as we prepare our shows, but I do think this one's really apropos. Like, if you started the podcast, well, I should have said this during the intro. On April 3rd, you could maybe save it for Holy Thursday. It's the institution of the Eucharist is one of the mysteries of the Rosary. I'm always just kind of blown away by the gift that Christ gave us in the gift of his body and blood, soul and divinity. And so, I don't know. I really like how it landed right near the start of Holy Week, and hopefully that can it'd be just a little way that folks move deeper into the celebration of the mysteries this week.
See, I thought you were, this is why you're a holier person than I am. I thought when you said if you started at, I thought you were going to say, like, you know, Pink Floyd. You know how if you start, like, The Dark Side of the Moon at the credits of,
Wizard
of
Oz.
Wizard of Oz, yeah. Right, yeah. So I was like, oh, wow, I didn't know that we matched up, but no, that's not what you were saying. So that's
if you play this episode backwards, it tells you, it gives you subliminal messages to pay for my children's college tuition.
Yeah, there's worse subliminal messages. That's what all we're saying. That's what we'll tell Matt Wilkin when that's also not true. We should probably tell that so the FCC doesn't get into us. But what is true is we have all sorts of ways in which people can join the prayer life of Iowa Catholic Radio. So if you don't mind telling the good people how they might do that.
Yeah, please join us in prayer. We broadcast the Rosary on air, so 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. You can also download the Iowa Catholic Radio app, as we've recommended you do, to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere. And then also in the afternoon, so 2:55 p.m., 3 p.m. has always been set aside as a time where you remember Christ's death. We pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy right at 2:55.
So we were talking about it being Easter coming up. Well, Easter, of course, but spring coming up. So, yes, Easter, everything like that. Makes total sense. But what this does mean, Bud, that it's almost golf time. So, like, May 18th at the Legacy Golf Club. That's the 2023 Iowa Catholic Radio Golf Classic. There's all sorts of events like that going on at the diocese. In the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area. All of the good folks who listen elsewhere, we would love you to be able to drive in and golf if you'd like. But if you're interested in events that are going on in the Diocese of Des Moines, but also just sort of broadly in central Iowa, the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com and check that out there. But as always, this ministry, and it's a ministry, it's not simply the people that you hear on air. It's not the people behind the boards or behind the desk. It's all of us. You are part of this ministry, and we can't exist without your time and talent, the volunteer work that you all do, the treasure that you give, the talents that you show by volunteering, the prayers that you give us, but then, yes, also almsgiving and treasure. I know, Bud, we've already talked about this in terms of the Lenten season, but as the Lent wraps up, maybe consider a gift here at Iowa Catholic Radio to make this ministry possible. You can call 515-223-1150 or text that same number, 515-223-1150. You can go to iowacatholicradio.com where there's a donate button. You can also donate with Iowa Catholic Radio app. But please consider donating to this ministry to keep it going, not only in Lenten season, not only to proclaim Easter glory as it ends up, but to keep this good work going, we appreciate all that you do. So, Bud, appreciate all that you do. I'm now worried about the golf game part because I think we're signed up for Mercy College.
No, I would also promote the Iowa Catholic Radio Golf Classic. You not only get a chance to golf on a beautiful golf course, but it's cheap entertainment. You can watch Bo and I hack away, wander through poison ivy to find lost golf balls. And it's also my anniversary eve, so you could come out and buy me a beer.
I like that. I like
to remember my 22nd.
Oh, wow. There you go. Early congratulations. And, of course, please make sure to join us, the Mercy College, April 14th, 9 a.m., the Mass, for the inauguration of our fourth president, Dr. Adrian Henry, who you guys have heard on Iowa Catholic Radio a bit. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.